I kept my eyes closed, but my ears were burning. The leather of my armchair was warm against my cheek, and the heavy oak door of my study was cracked open just enough, perhaps 3 inches, to act as a prism. Through that sliver of space, I could see the reflection of the hallway mirror. And in that mirror, I saw the end of my life as I knew it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I watched my wife, Linda, the woman I had shared a bed with for 32 years, lean back against the hallway console table. She was laughing. It wasn't the warm, melodic laugh I remembered from our honeymoon in Tuscany. It was a sharp, brittle sound, a conspirator's laugh, and she wasn't alone. Standing over her, boxing her in, with a familiarity that made my stomach turn, was Mark, my son-in-law. The man I had welcomed into this house when he was nothing but a failed cryptocurrency broker with a winning smile. The man I had loaned $200,000 to jumpstart a consulting firm that never seemed to consult anyone. They were celebrating. I saw Mark lift a bottle from the silver ice bucket. The green glass caught the afternoon light, and my heart hammered against my ribs. It was the 1995 Dom Perignon. The bottle I had bought the day I made senior partner. The bottle I had explicitly saved for the day I finally retired. The day I would walk away from 40 years of corporate litigation to travel the world with my wife. They were popping it now, without me. Mark poured the golden liquid into 2 flutes, the foam spilling over his fingers. He didn't wipe it off. He just licked his thumb, a vulgar, greedy gesture that told me everything I needed to know about how he viewed my assets. But the affair, the betrayal of the flesh, that wasn't the thing that made my blood run cold. Infidelity is painful, but it is common. I had litigated hundreds of divorces. I knew how to handle a cheating spouse. No. The real horror was sitting on the table next to the champagne. It was a thick stack of papers stapled at the top left corner. Even from 10 feet away, upside down in a mirror reflection, I recognized the blue cardstock backing. It was a standard legal filing cover for the state court. My vision blurred for a moment. I focused. I needed to see the header. Petition for emergency temporary guardianship. In RE, the incapacity of Arthur J. Sterling. The room seemed to tilt. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I listened. I forced myself to remain limp in the chair, mimicking the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the elderly nap they thought I was taking. I needed to hear the strategy. Mark's voice drifted through the crack, low and mocking. He wasn't whispering out of fear. He was whispering out of excitement. He told Linda that Dr. Aris had finally signed the affidavit. He bragged that the dementia narrative was solid. He joked that by Friday, I would be in the facility, and the study we were currently standing near would make an excellent billiard room. Linda didn't scold him. She didn't defend me. She simply sighed, a sound of relief. She murmured that it had to be done. She complained that I was becoming impossible to manage, that my questions about the bank accounts were becoming too frequent, too paranoid. She said it was a mercy. A mercy. She was calling my civil death a mercy. I felt a tear slide hot and fast down the bridge of my nose. I caught it with my tongue before it could drip onto my shirt. It tasted salty. It tasted like foolishness. I'd spent 4 decades as a shark in the courtroom. I was known as the surgeon because I could dissect a witness's credibility without raising my voice. I had protected Fortune 500 CEOs from federal indictments. I had dismantled hostile takeovers. I had seen the worst of human nature: greed, malice, avarice. But I had never looked for it at my own breakfast table. I realized then, with a sickening clarity, that the clumsiness I had been experiencing lately, the misplaced keys, the drowsiness after dinner, the confusion regarding dates, might not be age. I thought about the tea Linda brought me every night at 8 p.m., the tea that tasted slightly bitter, which she insisted was just valerian root for my sleep. My hands clenched the armrests, digging my fingernails into the leather. I wanted to burst through that door. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash that bottle of Dom Perignon over Mark's entitled head and demand my wife explain why she was signing away my freedom. But I didn't. I forced my muscles to relax. I forced my breathing to slow down. If I confronted them now, I would lose. I would be the angry, confused old man screaming about conspiracies. I would be exactly the dementia patient they were painting me to be. They would call the police. They would show the medical evidence. They would have me sedated and committed before the sun went down. No. This wasn't a family argument anymore. This was a hostile takeover. I listened as they clinked their glasses. The crystal chimed, a clear, beautiful sound that signaled the destruction of my life. Mark laughed again. He said that the hearing was Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Thursday. Today was Monday. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Its pendulum swung back and forth, slicing the time away. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I had 72 hours. 72 hours before a judge would bang a gavel and declare me non-compos mentis, mentally incompetent. 72 hours before my bank accounts were frozen and transferred to Linda's control. 72 hours before I was legally stripped of the right to hire a lawyer, vote, or even choose where I slept. 72 hours before I was locked in a memory care unit, drugged into a stupor while Mark played pool in the room where I had built my career. The stakes weren't just my heart, they were my existence. If they won, Arthur Sterling ceased to exist as a person and became a ward of the state. I would be nothing more than a breathing ATM machine for my wife and her lover. I heard their footsteps retreating down the hall. I heard the front door open and close as they went out to the patio to enjoy my champagne in the sunlight. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and suffocating. I opened my eyes. I stared at the ceiling. The tears were gone now. The sadness was evaporating, replaced by something cold, something hard, something familiar. It was the feeling I used to get before a closing argument, the feeling of absolute zero-degree focus. I wasn't a father anymore. I wasn't a husband anymore. I was the defendant, and I was going to represent myself. Pause. Have you ever looked at the people you love, the people you sacrificed everything for, and realized that you are the only prey they have left to hunt? Comment your city while you listen to how I survived the people who were supposed to mourn me. I waited. I counted to 500. I listened to the murmur of their voices drifting through the French doors and out into the garden. I heard the pop of a cork, a second bottle. They were comfortable. They were arrogant. They believed the old man was asleep, dreaming of a past that no longer mattered. They were wrong. I stood up. My knees didn't creak. My hands didn't shake. The adrenaline flooding my system was a cold, clarifying chemical. It was the same cocktail that had fueled me through 80-hour work weeks in the 90s. I walked to the hallway console table. The air still smelled of her perfume. Chanel No. 5. I used to buy it for her at the duty-free in Heathrow. Now it smelled like formaldehyde. The folder was gone. Panic flared for a microsecond. A sharp, hot needle in my chest. Had they taken it with them? Then I saw it. They hadn't taken it. They had simply discarded it. It was resting on top of the pile of junk mail in the wicker basket by the door, buried under a flyer for a landscaping service and a coupon for pizza. That was the insult that stung the most. My life, my freedom, my dignity, tossed into the to-be-sorted pile. I picked it up. The paper felt heavy, dense with malice. I retreated to the sanctuary of my study and locked the door. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I couldn't risk them seeing the glow from the garden. I switched on the green banker's lamp on my desk, angling the shade low. I put on my reading glasses, and I went to work. I wasn't a husband reading a betrayal. I was a senior partner reviewing opposing counsel's motion. I took out my red pen. Page 1. Petition for emergency guardianship. The drafting was sloppy. I recognized the boilerplate text immediately. They had downloaded a template from a do-it-yourself legal website. The font on the headers didn't match the body text. Allegation 1. The ward, Arthur Sterling, has exhibited rapid cognitive decline, including inability to manage finances and aggressive outbursts. I circled aggressive outbursts in red. Vague. No police reports. No dates. No affidavits from independent witnesses. In a real court, I would have this stricken in the first 5 minutes. But this wasn't a real trial. It was an ex parte hearing. They wouldn't need to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. They only needed to show probable cause to a judge who had 20 other cases on his docket that morning. They relied on the assumption that I wouldn't be there to object. Page 4. The medical affidavit. This was the smoking gun. A diagnosis of advanced vascular dementia signed by a Dr. Elias Aris, MD. I stared at the signature. It was a jagged, hasty scrawl. I had never met a Dr. Elias Aris. My primary care physician was Dr. Henderson, a man I played golf with. Linda knew that. She knew Dr. Henderson would never sign this. So she had gone shopping. I turned to my computer. I didn't open a web browser. I opened the VPN client connecting me to the firm's legacy database. I might be retired, but I still had my LexisNexis login. I typed in the name, Aris, Elias. The search bar spun, a digital hourglass counting down the validity of his medical license. Result, 14 hits. I clicked the first link. It wasn't a medical award. It was a disciplinary hearing from the State Medical Board, dated 3 years ago. Citation: overprescription of opioids. Probational license reinstated 2023. I clicked the second link. A lawsuit settled out of court. Estate of G. Miller versus Aris. Wrongful diagnosis leading to improper institutionalization. I let out a breath that rattled in my chest. He was a signer. In the legal world, we knew them well. Doctors with gambling debts or substance abuse problems who would sign any affidavit for $5,000 cash. He wasn't a neurologist. He was a mercenary with a stethoscope. I printed the disciplinary records. The printer hummed softly, a rhythmic whir-click-whir that sounded like ammunition being loaded into a magazine. But why now? Greed is timeless, but urgency has a trigger. Why Thursday? Why the rush to emergency guardianship? If they just waited for me to die naturally, they would get everything anyway. My will was standard, 100% to surviving spouse, unless there was a debt that couldn't wait for nature to take its course. I opened a new tab. I needed to look at Mark. I knew he played the role of the entrepreneur. He spoke in buzzwords: synergy, blockchain, disruptive tech. But I had never seen a balance sheet. I bypassed the standard credit checks. Those are for amateurs. I went to the dark corners of the public record, the UCC filings, and the civil docket search. I typed, Mark Daniels, nothing under his name in the county. I tried. His LLC, MD Ventures, Global, Hit, a lien, filed 3 weeks ago. Creditor, Apex Capital Funding. Amount, $480,000, high interest private lending, loan shark rates wrapped in a corporate suit. I dug deeper. I pulled the transaction history on the joint account I had foolishly set up for Linda for household expenses. I saw the withdrawals. August 4th, $15,000, cash. August 12th, $22,000, wire transfer to Coinbase. August 20th, $9,000, cash. They weren't just spending my money. They were hemorrhaging it. Mark was gambling on crypto futures, and he was losing badly. The math became simple, brutally simple. The $480,000 loan was likely due on Friday. If Mark didn't pay, the sharks would come for his knees. He didn't have the money, I did, but he couldn't access my main investment portfolio, the 4 Mallory estate, without my signature, unless I was incapacitated. If I was declared incompetent on Thursday, Linda would become my guardian. She would have power of attorney. She could liquidate my portfolio on Friday morning, pay off Mark's debt, and stash me in a home to rot while they burned through the rest. I sat back in my chair. The leather groaned. I looked at my hands. They looked old, veined, spotted. For a second, just a terrified second, I doubted myself. Did I have dementia? Was I imagining this? Was this paranoia the symptom they were talking about? Maybe Dr. Eris was real. Maybe Mark was a good boy. Maybe I was the villain here, constructing a conspiracy out of senility. I needed to know. I needed to calibrate the instrument. I pulled my dictaphone from the top drawer. I hadn't used it since my last trial. I pressed the red record button. The little light blinked, steady and unblinking. State versus Reynolds, 1989. I whispered to the empty room. Cite the precedent regarding the admissibility of hearsay in ex parte filings. I closed my eyes. I reached into the filing cabinets of my mind. Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 803. Exceptions to the rule against hearsay. Start with present sense impression, a statement describing or explaining an event or condition, made while or immediately after the declarant perceived it. I continued. I recited the statute of frauds. I recited the phone numbers of my first 3 clients. I recited the prime numbers up to 100. I spoke for 20 minutes. No stuttering, no pauses, no confusion. I played it back. The voice on the tape was old, gravelly, but it was sharp as a razor. It was the voice of a man who knew exactly who he was. I stopped the tape. I wasn't crazy. I was just rich, and I was in the way. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. My wife and son-in-law were asleep upstairs, likely dreaming of the yachts they would charter. They thought they were living in a tragedy where I was the victim. They didn't realize the genre had changed. This was now a procedural thriller, and I was the lead prosecutor. The numbers were the weapon, but I needed the motive. I needed the why. I had the what, the theft, the fraud, the conspiracy. But the why gnawed at me. Was it just the money? Or was it something deeper? A hatred festering under the surface of 30 years of Sunday brunches and anniversary cards? I turned my attention to the iPad Linda had left on the charging dock in the corner of the study. It was her recipe tablet, she called it. But I knew it was synced to her iCloud. I didn't want to look. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the home button. There is a specific kind of cowardice that affects even the toughest men. The fear of seeing the person you love unmasked. We prefer the lie because the lie is warm. The truth is often a cold, lonely place. I pressed the button. The screen lit up, blindingly bright in the dim room. Passcode? She used the same one for 20 years, 1993. The year our daughter was born. A code based on the happiest day of our lives. I tapped it in. The padlock icon unlocked. I opened the Messages app. The most recent thread was pinned at the top. Mark. I scrolled back. Not days, months. I was looking for a plan. What I found was a dissection. AUG 14, Mark. The old man is asking about the trust again. He's getting lucid. It's annoying. AUG 14, Linda. Just give him the tea. He'll be out by 8:30. Then we can talk. AUG 14, Linda. I can't stand the way he eats anymore. The chewing. It's like watching a corpse try to remember how to be alive. My stomach lurched. Bile rose in my throat, hot and acidic. The corpse. I had to put a hand on the desk to steady myself. The room seemed to spin. AUG 20. Mark. What if he fights the guardianship? He's still sharp, Linda. He recited the stock prices yesterday. AUG 20. Linda. He's not sharp. He's a creature of habit. He's a broken record. And don't worry about the fight. I've been playing the long con for 30 years. Honey, I can handle a few more days until the ink is dry. The long con. The words floated on the screen. Black pixels on a white background, absolute and undeniable. The long con. The room vanished. The smell of old books and leather faded. Suddenly, I was 32 years in the past. I was standing in a hospital room. The air smelled of iodine and cheap lilies. Linda was in the bed, pale, sweating, her hair matted against her forehead. She was gripping my hand so hard, I thought she would break my fingers. I can't do it, Arthur, she had sobbed, terrified of the C-section. I'm not strong enough. I had wiped the hair from her eyes. I had kissed her knuckles. You don't have to be strong alone, I whispered. I have enough strength for both of us. I will carry you. I will always carry you. I remembered the way she looked at me then. It wasn't with malice. It wasn't with calculation. It was with absolute trust. She looked at me like I was her savior, like I was the only solid thing in a spinning world. I had spent the next 3 decades making good on that promise. I carried the financial burden. I carried the stress of the lawsuits. I carried the family through the lean years and the boom years. I built this house not as an asset, but as a fortress to keep them safe. I thought I was the foundation. Reading those texts, I realized I wasn't the foundation. I was the floorboards they were walking on. And now that the floor was creaking, they were ready to rip it up and sell the wood. The long con. The grief hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a sadness. It was a tearing sensation in my chest. I felt like I was hemorrhaging internally. My hands started to shake. Not the tremor of age, but the violent vibration of shock. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to run upstairs and shake her awake and scream. Was it all a lie? The vacation in Cape Cod? The time I held your hand at your mother's funeral? Was that just part of the con? I gasped for air. I felt the sob building in my throat, a massive, jagged thing that threatened to tear me apart. No. I swallowed it. I forced it down. If I cried now, I was the victim. If I broke down, I was the emotional, unstable old man they described in their legal filing. I looked at the reflection of my own eyes in the dark screen of the iPad. They were wet, red-rimmed, but the pupil was small, focused. I wasn't Arthur the husband anymore. That man died the moment I read the words, the long con. I was Arthur the executor. I took a deep breath, inhaled the scent of the library, the scent of order, of law, of consequences. I took out my phone. I took photos of the text messages, every insult, every admission of the tea, which I now suspected was spiked with sedatives, every reference to Dr. Aris. I wasn't gathering memories. I was gathering Exhibit B. I carefully wiped the fingerprints off the iPad screen with my handkerchief. I placed it back on the dock, exactly at the angle I found it. I stood up. The nausea was gone. The shaking had stopped. A cold numbness settled over me. It was a relief. It was the anesthesia of the heart. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The sun was just beginning to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray. It was Tuesday morning. I had 48 hours left. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate implies passion. Hate implies that you still care what they think. I felt nothing. I viewed them now as I viewed a cancerous tumor during a medical malpractice suit, a biological mass that needed to be excised to save the patient. The patient was my dignity, and the surgery was about to begin. Pause. They say the truth hurts, but they're wrong. The truth doesn't hurt. The truth kills. Have you ever discovered that your entire life was just someone else's waiting room? Tuesday morning began with a performance. I walked into the kitchen at 8 a.m. sharp. The smell of bacon was in the air, a domestic perfume designed to mask the stench of conspiracy. Linda was at the stove. Mark was at the island, scrolling through his phone, likely checking the crypto markets to see if his debt had deepened overnight. They stopped talking the moment I entered. I shuffled. I made sure my steps were heavy, dragging the heel of my slipper slightly against the hardwood. I hunched my shoulders. I was playing the part they had written for me, the confused geriatric. Linda smiled. It was a tight, practiced expression. She asked how I slept. I mumbled something incoherent about bad dreams in the cold. I sat down. Then came the test. Linda placed a mug of coffee in front of me. Here, Arthur. Drink this. It will help you wake up. I lifted the mug. The steam hit my face. I took a sip and nearly gagged. Salt. The coffee was saturated with it. It tasted like seawater. I set the mug down, my hand trembling, partly from the act, partly from the sheer rage of being treated like a dog. I looked at her. I asked, confused, why the coffee tasted like the ocean. Linda exchanged a look with Mark, a look of pity, a look of, see? It's getting worse. She told me, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, that I had put the salt in myself. She claimed she watched me do it just a moment ago. She asked if I didn't remember grabbing the shaker. Mark chimed in. He said he saw it too. He said I was looking right at the sugar bowl, but grabbed the salt instead. He chuckled, saying it was a classic Arthur moment. For a split second, the lawyer in me wanted to cross-examine them. I wanted to point out the salt shaker was on the other side of the room. I wanted to scream that my cognitive faculties were sharper than their combined IQs. But I didn't. I looked down at my hands. I apologized. I told them my mind was playing tricks on me. I pushed the coffee away, acting ashamed. They bought it. I saw the tension leave Mark's shoulders. They believed I was breaking. They believed the dementia narrative was taking hold, aided by their gaslighting. Then came the blow that solidified my resolve. Mark leaned forward, biting into a piece of toast. He mentioned casually that he had called Sunshine Meadows, the facility they planned to dump me in. He said they had a room with a view of the parking lot. He said it would be good for me to have supervision, so I wouldn't make mistakes like the salted coffee. He called it assisted living. I knew Sunshine Meadows. I had sued them in the late 90s for neglect. It wasn't a home. It was a warehouse for the dying. I nodded. I thanked him for his concern. I told him he was a good son. The words tasted worse than the salt. By 10 a.m., I needed to get out. I needed to meet James. But there was a problem. My keys were gone. I checked the bowl by the door. Empty. I checked my coat pocket. Empty. Linda walked by, carrying a basket of laundry. She asked what I was looking for. I told her I wanted to drive to the pharmacy. She shook her head, like a mother correcting a toddler. She told me I had lost my keys yesterday. She said I had thrown them in the trash, and they hadn't been able to find them. She said it was for the best, that I really shouldn't be driving in my condition. The trap was tightening. House arrest. But they forgot one thing. I wasn't just a lawyer. I was a man who prepared for contingencies. I told her I would just go for a walk in the garden then. Maybe feed the ducks at the pond down the lane. She agreed. She thought a walk was harmless. She thought I was just an old man wandering aimlessly. I walked out the back door, wearing my heavy coat. I walked past the garden, past the gazebo where we had renewed our vows 10 years ago. I walked until I was out of sight of the house, shielded by the line of oak trees. I knelt down by the old potting shed. I reached under the rusted wheelbarrow I hadn't moved in 5 years. Duct taped to the underside was a magnetic key box. Inside was the spare key to my 1968 Mercedes convertible, the car I kept under a tarp in the detached garage, the one Mark didn't know how to drive because it was a stick shift. I stripped the tarp. The engine roared to life on the first turn. German engineering, reliable and defiant. I didn't take the main road. I took the back service lanes, avoiding the cameras at the community gate. I wasn't escaping. I was going to war. The diner was 20 miles away, a place called Sal's. It smelled of grease and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the country club atmosphere my wife craved. James was waiting in the back booth. James, the Hammer, O'Connor. He had been my junior partner for 15 years. I had taught him everything he knew about asset protection. He was ruthless, expensive, and loyal only to the checkbook. But he owed me. I had saved his career when he got into trouble with a jagged divorce in 2005. He stood up when he saw me. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with respect. He saw the fire in my eyes, not the fog. I sat down. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I slid the folder across the table. It contained the photos of the text messages, the dossier on Dr. Aris, and the financial records of Mark's debts. James flipped through them. He whistled low and long. He noted the salted coffee incident I described. He noted the date of the hearing. He looked up. He asked me what I wanted to do. He offered to file a restraining order. He offered to contest the guardianship. I shook my head. A restraining order was a piece of paper. Contesting the guardianship was a defense. I didn't want defense. I wanted total annihilation. I told him the plan. I wanted to trigger the nuclear option. I instructed him to draft an irrevocable blind trust. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the language. It had to be precise. Clause 1, the transfer. I was transferring the deed to the house, the investment portfolio, the liquid cash, and the vintage car collection into the trust immediately. Clause 2, the beneficiary. The sole beneficiary of the trust would be the National Center on Elder Abuse. Clause 3, the stipend. I would retain a small, fixed monthly stipend for living expenses, just enough for a small apartment and food. Clause 4, the loophole, the trap. The trust would officially take ownership at 11:59 p.m. tonight. This meant that when Linda and Mark walked into court on Thursday morning, they would be fighting for guardianship over a man who was technically penniless. The estate they wanted to control would be empty. But I wasn't done. I told James to draft one more document. A document that I would deliver myself. A notice to quit. A 24-hour eviction notice. Since the house was now owned by the trust, and Linda and Mark were not beneficiaries or tenants, they were technically squatters. The trust had a zero-tolerance policy for unauthorized occupants. James looked at me. He stopped writing. He took off his glasses. He asked me if I was sure. He reminded me that this was scorched earth. He reminded me that I was effectively making myself homeless to spite them. He asked if I still loved her. I looked out the window at the gray parking lot. I thought about the salt in the coffee. I thought about the text message, the corpse. I told him that the woman I loved died a long time ago. The woman in my house was just a stranger who knew my PIN code. I signed the papers. The pen scratched against the paper. A harsh, final sound. I stood up. I shook James's hand. File it, I said. And timestamp it. I drove back to the house. I parked the car, covered it with the tarp, and slipped the key back under the wheelbarrow. I walked into the kitchen just as Linda was starting lunch. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Just feeding the ducks," I said, staring blankly at the wall. "They looked so hungry. Everyone is so hungry these days." She rolled her eyes and went back to chopping vegetables. She didn't notice the ink stain on my finger. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for it to snap. Wednesday dragged. Time didn't move. It coagulated. The house, once a sanctuary of noise and laughter, now felt like a mausoleum. I moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting my own life. I touched the spine of the books in the library. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister. I was saying goodbye. This house was my masterpiece. I had paid for every brick with billable hours, with missed school plays, with dinners eaten cold at my desk. And now, I was burning it down to save my soul. The sun went down, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. I retreated to the guest bedroom downstairs. I had been sleeping there for a month, exiled by Linda's complaints about my restless legs. Tonight, it was my war room. I began the ritual of preparation. It wasn't a physical preparation so much as a spiritual armor plating. I needed to become the lawyer one last time. I needed to shed the skin of the husband and father. I opened the closet. My trial suits hung there in plastic bags, dusty from disuse. I pushed aside the moth-eaten cardigans Linda had bought me, the uniform of the harmless retiree. I reached for the charcoal gray Brooks Brothers suit. The wool was cool to the touch. I checked the pockets. Empty. Clean. I took out my shoes, black Oxfords. I sat on the edge of the bed with a tin of polish and a rag. Swish, swish, swish. The rhythmic sound of the brush against the leather was hypnotic. It was the sound of order being restored. With every stroke, I buffed away the confused old man. I buffed away the victim. I buffed away the heartbreak. I polished them until I could see my own reflection in the toe. The face staring back wasn't sad. It was terrifyingly calm. I laid the clothes out on the bed. The suit, the white shirt, starched stiff, the silk tie, crimson red, the power tie. Then I turned to the documents. James had emailed the final PDF of the trust deed. I connected my laptop to the portable printer I kept in the guest room closet. Click. Click. The pages slid out, warm and crisp. The Arthur Sterling Irrevocable Trust. Asset transfer schedule. Real property, 124 Maple Drive. Effective date, December 31st, 11:59 p.m. I held the paper. It was lighter than air, but it held the weight of a guillotine blade. I printed the second document, the eviction notice. I placed them in a manila folder, no markings, just a blank, anonymous folder. I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, thudding steps. Mark. Then the lighter, quicker steps of Linda. They were moving around the master bedroom, my master bedroom. I heard them laughing. It was a muffled sound through the ceiling, but it pierced me. I walked over to the dresser where I kept a framed photograph. It was taken 20 years ago. Linda holding our daughter at her graduation. Mark wasn't in the picture. Just us. We looked happy. We looked invincible. I looked at that younger version of Linda. Her smile reached her eyes then. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the photo. I wasn't apologizing for what I was about to do. I was apologizing to the memory of the woman she used to be. I was apologizing that I hadn't seen the rot setting in sooner. I was apologizing that I had let money become the language of our love until the currency devalued and left us bankrupt of anything real. I took the photo out of the frame. I folded it in half, then in half again. I didn't tear it. I simply placed it in the shredder. Zuzzed. It was gone. I didn't cry. You don't cry when you amputate a gangrenous limb. You just grit your teeth and pray the infection hasn't reached the heart. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. I sat in the chair by the window and waited for midnight. The house settled. The pipes groaned. The wind rattled the pane. I thought about the why. Why did they do it? It wasn't just greed. Greed is simple. This was contempt. They despised me because I was the gatekeeper. They hated that they needed me. They hated that their comfort was dependent on my labor. So they decided to remove the gatekeeper and keep the gate. They forgot that the gatekeeper also holds the key to the lock. 11:55 p.m. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the darkness, lit only by the street lamp outside. 11:58 p.m. I closed my eyes and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, controlling the heart rate. 11:59 p.m. Done. The trust was active. The electronic filing had cleared. The house I was sitting in no longer belonged to Arthur Sterling. It belonged to the elder abuse charity. I was now a guest in a stranger's property. And so were they. The legal reality of the world had shifted under their feet while they slept. They were dreaming of millions, unaware that they were already destitute. I felt a strange sense of peace, the high of the gamble, the cold thrill of the checkmate. I stood up. I undressed and put on my pajamas, hiding the suit back in the closet. I needed to sleep. I needed to be fresh. Tomorrow was Thursday, the day of the hearing. But before the court, there was the family intervention they had planned for breakfast, the final performance before they hauled me away. I climbed into the cold bed. I pulled the duvet up to my chin. I slept like a baby. I slept the sleep of the just. Pause. They say the hardest part of a trap is the waiting, but that's not true. The hardest part is watching the mouse walk toward the cheese, knowing it's about to break its neck, and feeling absolutely nothing but the desire to hear the snap. Have you ever had to kill the person you were to survive the people you loved? Thursday morning arrived with the sterile brightness of a hospital corridor. I woke up at 6 a.m. I showered. I shaved with a steady hand, watching the gray stubble vanish down the drain, revealing the sharp jawline of the man I used to be. I dressed in the charcoal suit, tying the crimson silk tie with a double Windsor knot, tight, symmetrical, professional. But I didn't walk out yet. I put my bathrobe on over the suit, concealing the armor. I needed them to underestimate me for exactly 30 more minutes. I walked into the dining room at 8 a.m. The stage was set. The long mahogany table was laid out with pastries that no one intended to eat. The air was thick, with a performative somberness. Linda was at the head of the table, clutching a tissue. Mark stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, in a tableau of support that looked like it had been blocked by a bad theater director. And there, sitting to the right with a notepad, was Mrs. Gable. I knew Mrs. Gable. She was a court-appointed social worker, overworked, underpaid, and generally well-meaning. She was here to rubber-stamp the affidavit before the 9 a.m. hearing. She was the witness they needed to prove that immediate removal was necessary. I shuffled in, leaning heavily on a cane I didn't need. I sat down at the far end of the table. Mrs. Gable offered me a sad, pitying smile. She asked how I was feeling. I didn't answer. I just stared at the centerpiece, a vase of white lilies. Funerary flowers. Linda took my silence as her cue. She began the opening statement. The first lie, the narrative of violence. Linda turned to Mrs. Gable, her voice trembling with a vibrato that I knew took practice. She described the incident from last night. She claimed that I had become violent in the kitchen. She told the social worker that I had thrown a carving knife at her because I didn't recognize who she was. She said I had screamed that there were intruders in the house. I watched her. I watched the way she dabbed at dry eyes. I remembered last night perfectly. I'd been in the guest room, polishing my shoes. There was no knife. There was no screaming. There was only the sound of me preparing to dismantle her life. But I didn't interrupt. I didn't shout, "Objection!" I let the lie hang in the air, poisoning the room. I watched Mrs. Gable write it down. Violent outbursts, safety risk. The second lie, the financial hemorrhage. Mark stepped in for the second movement. He wanted to establish the financial necessity of the guardianship. He leaned over the table, using his serious business voice. He told Mrs. Gable that it wasn't just the violence, it was the money. He claimed that in my confusion, I had transferred $50,000 to a Nigerian prince scam email last week. He claimed that I had stopped paying the utility bills and that the electricity was days away from being cut off. He said he had been covering the mortgage out of his own pocket, just to keep a roof over our heads. I looked at Mark. I looked at the sweat gathering on his upper lip. It was a bold lie. It was a projection. He was the one who had lost money. He was the one with the debts. He was confessing his own sins and attributing them to me. I felt a cold curiosity. I wondered if he actually believed it. The mind is a powerful editor. Perhaps he had convinced himself that stealing my money was actually saving it. Mrs. Gable nodded sympathetically. She wrote it down. Financial incompetence. Vulnerable to fraud. The third lie. The mercy kill. Then came the closer. The emotional hook. Linda reached out across the table and tried to take my hand. I pulled it away slowly, as if confused. She looked at Mrs. Gable and delivered the final blow. She said that this was the hardest decision of her life. She said that Sunshine Meadows was a beautiful facility, a place where I would get the 24-hour care that she simply couldn't provide anymore, despite her love. She claimed that Dr. Eris had told them it was the only way to prolong my life. She said they were doing this because they loved me too much to watch me fade away in this big, empty house. "It's an act of mercy," she whispered, looking at the floor. The room fell silent. The performance was complete. They had painted the picture of a tragic, broken man and his heroic, suffering family. They had checked every box required for the emergency guardianship. Mrs. Gable closed her notebook. She looked at me with genuine sorrow. She began to explain the procedure, how the ambulance was on its way, how it would be a gentle transition. I cleared my throat. It was a sharp, deliberate sound. Not the cough of an old man, but the gavel strike of a judge. I stood up. I let the cane fall to the floor. It clattered loudly against the hardwood. Clack, clack, clack. Linda jumped. Mark took a step back. I reached up to the collar of my bathrobe. I untied the sash. I let the heavy terry cloth robe slide off my shoulders and pool on the floor behind me. I stood there in the charcoal Brooks Brothers suit, the crimson tie, the starched white shirt. I adjusted my cufflinks. The silence that followed was not the silence of pity. It was the silence of a bomb squad watching the timer reach 0. Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the suit. She recognized it. It was the suit I wore to court. It was the suit I wore when I won. Mark looked confused. He looked from me to the robe on the floor, trying to reconcile the dementia patient with the man standing before him. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. I didn't pull out a weapon. I pulled out the remote control for the wall-mounted projector screen I used for trial prep. I pressed the button. Whirr. The screen descended from the ceiling, blocking their view of the garden. I connected my phone to the wireless dongle. "I believe," I said, my voice deep and steady, devoid of any tremor, "that the defense has the right to cross-examine the witnesses." I didn't look at Mrs. Gable. I looked at Linda. I saw the color drain from her face. I saw the terror dawn in her eyes. She realized in that split second that the long con was over. I tapped the screen of my phone. The first image appeared on the projector. The projector hummed. A low mechanical drone that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. The first image hit the screen. It was blown up to 4 feet wide. High definition. Undeniable. There it was, floating above the vase of white lilies. The screenshot of the conversation between my wife and her lover. The corpse. The long con. Just give him the tea. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I simply pointed the laser pointer at the timestamp. August 14th. The same day, Linda had told me she loved me before kissing me goodnight. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Gable. She adjusted her glasses, leaning forward. She looked from the screen to Linda, her face hardening. The sympathy she had felt for the grieving wife evaporated instantly, replaced by the professional horror of a mandatory reporter witnessing abuse. Linda didn't move. She was frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, trapped in a rictus of terror. She looked like a deer staring into the headlights of an 18-wheeler. She tried to stammer a denial, to claim the images were faked, but the words died in her throat. The evidence was too specific, too raw. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. Now it displayed the disciplinary record of Dr. Elias Aris, the suspension for opioid distribution, the lawsuit for wrongful diagnosis, and right next to it, a bank statement from our joint account showing a wire transfer of $5,000 to Aris Consulting LLC, dated 2 days ago. I watched Mark. He began to sweat profusely. The sweat didn't bead, it ran down his temples in rivulets. He loosened his tie. He realized that the medical evidence they had pinned their hopes on was now a documented felony. Mrs. Gable stood up. She closed her notebook with a snap. She wasn't writing anymore. She was reaching for her phone, likely to call her supervisor, or perhaps the police. I clicked the remote one last time. The irrevocable trust deed appeared. I highlighted the relevant section with the red laser dot. 124 Maple Drive, transferred. Investment portfolio, transferred. I watched the realization wash over them. It was a slow, crushing wave. Mark squinted at the screen. He read the words blind trust. He read the words elder abuse charity. He did the math. I saw the exact moment his soul broke. His eyes widened. His jaw went slack. He looked around the room, at the crystal chandelier, at the silver cutlery, at the imported rug, and realized he was looking at a museum exhibit he couldn't afford a ticket to. He turned to Linda. His face wasn't loving anymore. It was twisted with panic. He hissed at her, asking if she knew about this. He accused her of missing it. The alliance of the long con shattered in seconds when the money vanished. Linda ignored him. She looked at me. For the first time in years, she really looked at me. Not at the checkbook, not at the obstacle, but at the man. She started to cry. But this time, there was no audience. This time the tears were real. They were the tears of a woman who realizes she has bet everything on a pair of deuces against a royal flush. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. She reached out to me. She opened her mouth to beg. She was going to say, it was a mistake. She was going to say, she was confused. She was going to try to charm the husband she thought she could still manipulate. I didn't flinch. I didn't retreat. I looked her dead in the eye. I looked at the wrinkles around her mouth that I used to kiss. I looked at the hands that had poisoned my coffee. I felt a heavy, crushing weight in my chest. The weight of 30 years of love turning into ash. I took a deep breath, inhaled the scent of the lilies and the ozone from the projector, and I delivered the verdict. You didn't marry a senile old man, Linda. You married a lawyer who reads the fine print. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't a triumph. It was a funeral. I pressed the button on the remote. The screen went black. They say that revenge is a dish best served cold, but they don't tell you that after you eat it, you still have to sit at the empty table alone. Have you ever won the war, only to realize you burned down your own home to do it? The end of a marriage does not sound like a crash. It sounds like the quiet click of a front door latch engaging for the last time. The police arrived 10 minutes later. Mrs. Gable had called them, citing a volatile domestic situation and potential fraud. But there was no drama. There were no handcuffs. It was all very administrative. I watched from the window as the officers escorted Linda and Mark to their car. They didn't look back at the house. They were already on their phones, likely calling divorce lawyers, frantically trying to find a loophole in the trust I had spent 30 years learning how to build. They were trespassers now. The house belonged to the charity, and I was just the caretaker of the ruins. I turned away from the window. The room was silent. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a submarine that has gone too deep. I walked back to the table. The projector was still humming, casting a blue square of light against the wall. I turned it off. I looked at the bottle of Dom Perignon. They had opened on Monday. It was still sitting on the sideboard, warm and flat. I poured myself a glass. I sat down in my leather armchair, the same chair where I had feigned sleep while they planned my demise. I took a sip. It tasted like vinegar. It tasted like victory. I looked around the library. I looked at the law degrees framed on the wall. I looked at the photos of the vacations we had taken. Bali, Paris, Aspen. For decades, I thought those photos were proof of a happy life. Now I realized they were just receipts. I had spent my life thinking that if I provided enough, if I protected them enough, if I built walls of gold high enough, they would love me for the safety I gave them. I was wrong. I created a greenhouse. And in that greenhouse, I raised people who had never felt the cold wind of consequence. They grew soft. They grew entitled. They grew to believe that the fruit simply appeared on the vine, without anyone needing to till the soil. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet. I found a small creased photo tucked behind my driver's license. It wasn't a photo of Linda. It was a photo of me, 40 years ago. I was standing on the steps of the courthouse after winning my first case. I looked hungry. I looked honest. I looked like a man who believed that justice always led to a happy ending. I traced the face of that young man with my thumb. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him that the hardest cases aren't the ones you fight against corporations or criminals. The hardest cases are the ones you fight against your own heart. I wanted to tell him that there is a difference between being smart and being wise. Mark and Linda were smart. They knew the codes. They knew the loopholes. They knew how to manipulate the system. But they weren't wise. Wisdom is knowing that you can inherit a house, but you cannot inherit a home. Wisdom is knowing that you can steal a fortune, but you cannot steal peace of mind. They had the capacity to take everything, but they lacked the character to keep it. I closed my eyes and let the first real tear fall. It wasn't for me. I would be fine. I had my stipend. I had my books. I had the clean, cold comfort of the law. I cried for them. I cried because they were now out in the world, stripped of the armor I had provided, naked, against the storm they had invited. They would spend the rest of their lives blaming me. They would tell their friends I was a monster. They would tell themselves they were victims. They would never understand that I didn't cut them off to hurt them. I cut them off to save the only thing I had left, my self-respect. I looked at the phone sitting on the desk. I knew it wouldn't ring. I knew Linda wouldn't call to apologize. I knew Mark wouldn't call to ask for forgiveness. People like that don't mourn the loss of the person. They only mourn the loss of the access. They were grieving the ATM, not the father. They were grieving the lifestyle, not the husband. So I sat there in the fading light, listening to the clock tick, tick, tock, tick, tock. The house was empty. The bank accounts were empty. My heart was empty. But for the first time in 30 years, my conscience was full. I finished the champagne. I set the glass down. I waited for the silence to end, but I knew it never would.